creation and fall, at the beginning of everything, before even the conception of time. God existed as the only being from eternity. In a majestic act, He decided to create the heavens and the earth, giving rise to all existence. A magnificent work that reflected His sovereignty and incomparable creativity. The crown of His creation came with the formation of man, molded in His own image. This singular creature received the breath of life directly from God, becoming a living being, conscious and endowed with free will. Harmony reigned in the first days, and man enjoyed divine proximity in Eden. However, even in this paradise, humanity faced its greatest trial. Adam and Eve, the first human beings, succumbed to the subtle temptation of the serpent. The forbidden fruit, offered with deceitful promises, became the catalyst for the fall. Disobedience introduced sin into the world, irreversibly altering the relationship between God and His children. Upon biting the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve experienced the bitter reality of separation from God. Their actions resulted not only in their own spiritual fall, but also in the inheritance of sin for all humanity. Initial purity was replaced by the knowledge of good and evil, and Eden was left behind, guarded by cherubim. This foundational episode, recorded in the pages of the Bible, illustrates human fragility. The event of the creation and fall reverberates throughout the Scriptures, demonstrating the need for redemption and pointing to the promise of a Savior who restores the lost communion between God and humanity. Pre-flood, the trajectory of humanity after the fall of Adam and Eve reveals the complexity of human nature and the incessant search of God for restoration. The ancient world was full of intrigue and challenges, with societies that were forming and establishing themselves in distinct ways. However, the heart of the people turned away from morality and integrity, yielding to temptations and deviating from the path of righteousness. The book of Genesis transports us to this period, where humanity, despite divine guidance, found itself in a state of moral decay. The relationships between people were marked by betrayals, greed, and an unbridled search for power. In Genesis 6, verses 1 to 13, we read the following: "And it came to pass that, as men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took for themselves wives of all whom they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive forever with man, because he is also flesh, but his days shall be 120 years. Some interpretations about this passage consider that sons of God refers to angels who, disobeying the natural order of things, descended to earth and possessed the women in a way to generate a hybrid race of giants, described by some as being the Nephilim. Would this be the last straw that caused God to send the flood? On the other hand, there is the understanding that chapter 6 of Genesis is contextualized with chapters 4 and 5, so that in chapter 4 we see the portrait of the lineage of Cain, while in chapter 5, that of Seth, the third son of Adam. In this way, the term daughters of men seems to refer to women descendants of the wicked lineage of Cain, while the lineage of Seth represents the lineage that remains faithful to the Creator, named as sons of God. The word giant, that defines the fruit of the crossing of these races, comes originally from the translation of King James and can also be translated as fallen ones or tyrants. Regardless of these interpretations, in this turbulent context emerged the figure of Noah. This man is presented in the Bible as a figure of extraordinary justice and righteousness, standing out amidst the corruption that permeated his society. Noah was the son of Lamech and grandson of Methuselah. Besides his wife, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The introduction of Noah in the biblical narrative is marked by characteristics that distinguish him as someone singular. The book of Genesis describes him as righteous among his contemporaries and a blameless man among the people of his time. These words reverberate as a divine compliment to the integrity of Noah, making him a central figure amidst the moral decay that surrounded the ancient world. While the society around him gave itself to corrupt practices and distanced itself from divine paths, Noah remained firm in his devotion to God and in his irreproachable conduct. Amidst the growing corruption and wickedness that permeated the antediluvian society, God, in his sovereignty and justice, resolved to purify the earth through the flood. The biblical account found in the book of Genesis reveals the divine decision to intervene in the face of the moral degeneration that had reached a critical point. At this time, God looks at Noah and finds in him a light of righteousness and justice. The divine call to Noah reveals itself as an act of grace and divine choice. God, in his wisdom, decides not only the creation, but to offer an opportunity for preservation and renewal through Noah. The biblical text highlights that Noah, however, found grace in the eyes of the Lord, indicating that his relationship with God was the determining factor for his choice. God communicates his call to Noah with detailed instructions on the construction of the ark. The complexity of the project and the wealth of details reflect the seriousness of the divine purpose. Noah, as a man of unshakable faith, receives the monumental task with submission and obedience. The ark had, according to the biblical account contained in chapter 6 of Genesis, 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, by 30 cubits in height. A cubit, an ancient measure out of use nowadays, would be about 45 centimeters. And thus, the dimensions of the ark would be equivalent to 137 meters in length, 22 meters in width, by 13 meters in height, which is equivalent to an area of more than 43,000 square meters. The Bible describes the ark as having 3 stories, an opening for lighting, and specific compartments for animals of all species. God, in his omniscience, reveals to Noah the exact specifications for the ark. Each detail is communicated in a clear manner, reflecting divine foreknowledge, with pitch being an integral part of the divine plan, ensuring durability and conservation. The work continues with Noah and his family dedicating themselves tirelessly to the construction of the ark. The disbelief of the society around him does not shake him. On the contrary, it intensifies his determination to obey the divine voice. It is not known for sure how many years Noah took to build the ark. The apocryphal book of Jasher, in chapter 5, states that Noah took 5 years to build it. It seems like a reasonable time in which, in parallel, one would have to organize the planting and reservation of food to be consumed for 1 year by Noah's family and by the animals on board the ark. An additional miracle unfolds as the peaceful coexistence between animals of different species is established. The biblical account not only emphasizes the obedience of the animals to the divine instructions, but also the peace and harmony that reign inside the vessel, challenging natural expectations and highlighting, once again, the providential hand of God. The beginning of the flood is described as the floodgates of heaven being opened, with the celestial waters falling incessantly upon the earth. The biblical description highlights that all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The torrential rains begin to transform the familiar scenery into an unrecognizable landscape, preparing the stage for the flood that will swallow all creation, as the waters advance relentlessly, swallowing plains, mountains, and everything it finds in its path. The biblical narrative emphasizes the universality of the flood. The Bible makes it clear that all the highest mountains under the whole heaven were covered, The rain falls incessantly for 40 days and 40 nights, plunging the earth into a state of constant flow. The ark built by Noah floats on this vast ocean of turbulent waters, representing not only a physical shelter, but a symbol of divine salvation amidst the flood. The narrative highlights the divine providence that guides the ark through the waters, protecting Noah and his family. The biblical text describes Noah, after 40 long days of flood, deciding to send the dove to investigate the conditions outside the ark. The dove, serene messenger of life, flies over the turbulent waters, indicating that the surface of the earth was not yet ready to welcome life again. However, the narrative gains depth at the moment when the dove returns to the ark with an olive leaf in its beak. Noah, interpreting the gesture of the dove as a confirmation of the restoration of the earth, waits with patience and gratitude for the right moment to open the window of the ark. The Bible highlights that Noah waited another 7 days before opening the window again, indicating his caution and desire to confirm the stability of the soil before disembarking. The covenant of God with Noah after the flood represents a culmination point in the biblical narrative, marking the transition from destruction to the promise of a new era. The account found in the book of Genesis reveals the compassionate and redemptive nature of the Creator, who, after the catastrophe of the waters, establishes a lasting covenant with Noah and all creation. The narrative begins with Noah and his family coming out of the ark, witnessing a transformed earth after the flood. In this post-catastrophic scenario, Noah offers sacrifices to the Lord as an expression of his gratitude and devotion. It is in this context that God, in his mercy, establishes the covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy all life on earth through a flood. The symbolism of the rainbow appears as a crucial element in this divine covenant. God declares that the rainbow will be the visible sign of this promise, a constant reminder of the covenant between him and all creation. The consequences of the flood, narrated in the book of Genesis, transcend the cataclysmic event itself, extending to the changes on earth and in humanity. The waters receded, revealing an altered landscape and regions that were previously submerged. The account mentions the formation of mountains and valleys, suggesting a geological reconfiguration caused by the titanic forces of the flood. The consequences on humanity are also notable. The Bible describes that Noah and his family, the only survivors of the flood, became the progenitors of all post-flood humanity. The genealogies that unfold after the event trace the lines of future nations and peoples, outlining the human diversity that emerged from the family of Noah. The 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their respective wives, are presented as the parents of the different lineages that spread across the earth. Each of these lineages gave rise to different ethnic groups and nations, contributing to human diversity. Shem was blessed by Noah and was assigned the responsibility of repopulating the region that would later be known as the Middle East. Shem is frequently associated with the Semitic peoples, including Hebrews and Arabs. To Japheth was assigned the task of repopulating the regions that spanned Europe and parts of Asia. Genesis chapter 9, verse 27, states, God enlarged Japheth, while Ham, for his part, received a designation to repopulate the region that would later be associated with Africa. The offspring of Ham is closely linked to the African peoples. This division of responsibilities was symbolically represented by the blessing of Noah to his sons. Each was destined to play a role in the repopulation of the earth, contributing to the ethnic and cultural diversity that would emerge in the subsequent eras. Here, it is worth remembering the episodes of disobedience associated with the lineage of Ham. One day, Noah planted a vineyard and, upon becoming intoxicated with wine, he lay uncovered within his tent. His youngest son, Ham, saw his father's nakedness and, instead of covering him or maintaining discretion, went to tell his older brothers, Shem and Japheth. Shem and Japheth, unlike Ham, showed respect for their father's nakedness. They entered the tent backwards, carrying a garment to cover Noah, without looking at him. When Noah awoke and learned of what happened, he pronounced a curse upon the lineage of Ham, while he blessed the lineages of Shem and Japheth. This genealogy serves as a base for the subsequent narratives of the Bible, connecting the stories of the great patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the post-flood humanity. The story of the Tower of Babel is found in the book of Genesis, in the Old Testament of the Bible, specifically in verses 1 to 9 of chapter 11. This narrative begins after the flood, when humanity begins to multiply and spread across the earth. Although the Bible mentions the Tower of Babel, its exact location is uncertain. Various theories and hypotheses suggest that it could have been located in Mesopotamia, in ancient Babylon, or in another region. At the beginning of history, all the inhabitants of the earth spoke the same language and had a common, very ambitious purpose. They decided to build a city with a tower that would reach the heavens. This tower, known as the Tower of Babel, was seen as a symbol of power and human achievement. The main motivation behind this undertaking was clear. They wanted a demonstration of power, authority, and also to avoid being scattered over the face of the earth. Given the context of the biblical narrative that occurs after Noah's flood, it is possible that the builders of the Tower of Babel also had a persistent fear of another flood. They could have believed that building a high tower that would reach the heavens was a way to protect themselves against the return of a catastrophic flood. This motivation would be linked to the preservation of life and the survival of the community in an environment where the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were a real threat. However, the desire for protection against a new flood demonstrated disbelief in God, since after the floods, the Lord God made it clear, "Never again will any form of life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." Genesis chapter 9, verse 11. Another theory suggests that the Tower of Babel could also have been built as a defensive military structure in ancient Mesopotamia. The city-states frequently faced threats of invasions from neighboring peoples or pagan tribes, as they were called at the time. The construction of a high tower could have served as a strategic observation post to detect approaching enemies, and as a fortress to protect themselves in case of attack. In this way, the tower would have both a practical and symbolic function, representing the defense of the city against external threats. However, the builders of the tower believed they could reach the heavens through their own skills and efforts, thus challenging the authority and the will of God. This symbolized human rebellion against the Creator. It is worth remembering that in Genesis, God blessed Noah and his sons, telling them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth." God had ordered humanity to spread across the earth after the flood. The descendants of the tower disobeyed this order, showing disbelief and lack of submission to the divine will, preferring to follow their own path to divine instructions. Led by a man named Nimrod, whose charisma and power of persuasion were immeasurable, the builders had grandiose ambitions, and this ambition led to the desire to build an increasingly higher tower that, in the end, would reach the sky. A descendant of Noah, Nimrod, is mentioned in the Bible as a notable king of great power on earth. According to Jewish interpretations, Nimrod was responsible for the first commission of the construction of the Tower of Babel. Nimrod was known as a tyrant leader who sought to turn people away from the worship of God. In this context, the idea of building the tower emerged in an attempt to challenge God. It is important to observe that Babel was the capital of the rich and powerful Babylon, where the construction of temples in the form of a pyramid was a common practice among the Babylonians, Sumerians, and Assyrians. However, God, disappointed, observed what was happening and decided to intervene in the construction. He would not allow humanity to follow its own path, challenging his authority and especially disobeying his instructions. So, God, in a divine act, decided to confuse the languages of all the builders of the tower. Suddenly, each builder began to speak and understand a different language, making communication between them impossible. Initially, this act caused enormous confusion, ruining the continuation of the project and the plans to build a tower that would reach the sky. After the confusion of languages, the chaos was established in that city. The inability to live in a society with diverse groups of people speaking different languages made communication and coexistence impossible, leading to the dispersion of humanity into different groups and regions. The name Babel is derived from the Hebrew word Babel, which means confusion. This is a direct reference to the confusion of languages that occurred in history. This dispersion of the population through different regions fulfilled the original will of God that humanity would spread across the earth after the flood, so that it would be completely populated. Each linguistic group gave rise to its own culture, nation, and identity. The story of the Tower of Babel is frequently related to the emergence of Semitic languages like Hebrew and Aramaic. This has profound implications in the history of language. Furthermore, the diversification of human languages resulting from the tower molded the history and culture of humanity, demonstrating how biblical events have deeply influenced the world throughout the centuries. The Patriarchs, the saga of the Patriarchs, marked by complex family relationships and divinely orchestrated events, played a fundamental role in biblical history, molding the trajectory of the people of God. Abraham, originally called Abram, is considered the central patriarch in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. He is venerated as a key figure in the relationship between God and humanity. The story of Ishmael and Isaac begins with the complex relationship between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Initially, Abraham and Sarah faced the difficulty of Sarah's sterility. In a moment of concern and questioning on the part of Abraham, God communicates directly with him, offering words of encouragement and reiterating his promise of a numerous offspring. However, even after the divine promise, Abraham and Sarah continue without being able to have children. Seeking a solution for the desire to have a child and heir, Sarah suggests that Abraham, her husband, have a child with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. Abraham agrees, and Hagar conceives Ishmael. This conception does not happen without conflicts. The Bible reports tensions and rivalries between Sarah and Hagar. After Hagar's pregnancy, Sarah begins to treat her in a severe manner, leading Hagar to flee to the desert. It is in this context that an angel of the Lord finds Hagar and prophesies the birth of Ishmael and his offspring. The story takes a new turn when Hagar, encouraged by the prophetic words, decides to return to Abraham's house. This return reaffirms the family connection and also marks the beginning of a journey where the divine purpose for Ishmael would begin to unfold. After the birth of Ishmael, the biblical narrative continues with significant events in the life of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. The Bible reports that sometime after the birth of Ishmael, God appeared again to Abraham and renewed his promises, specifically mentioning that Sarah, despite her advanced age, would give birth to a son. Sarah, hearing this, initially laughs in disbelief, but God confirms that nothing is impossible for him. The story culminates with the birth of Isaac, the second son of Abraham, but this time with Sarah. The name Isaac means laughter in Hebrew, reflecting Sarah's reaction to hearing the divine promise. The birth of Isaac is marked by joy and gratitude, representing the fulfillment of the divine promise of a numerous offspring. The family dynamic, however, becomes more complex as the children grow. The tensions between Sarah and Hagar increase, resulting eventually in the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Ishmael, as the rejected son, faces issues of identity and belonging in the desert. Hagar and Ishmael experience loneliness and uncertainty. The Bible highlights Hagar's anguish as she sees her son suffering, and Ishmael's struggle to adapt to an unfavorable environment at a certain moment. The situation of Hagar and Ishmael in the desert became desperate. The water ran out, and they were facing the prospect of dying of thirst. In her suffering, Hagar places Ishmael under one of the bushes and moves away, unable to bear seeing her son perish. At this critical moment, God intervenes. An angel of the Lord calls Hagar from heaven and asks what is the problem. The angel then tells Hagar not to be afraid and promises that God heard the cry of Ishmael. The angel reveals that God will provide a great nation from Ishmael. God then opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water nearby. Hagar goes to the well, fills the skin with water, and gives it to Ishmael to drink. This well, provided miraculously by God, saves the life of Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. After the divine intervention that provided water in the desert, Ishmael and Hagar continued to live in the desert of Paran. Ishmael grew up, became an expert hunter, skilled in bow and arrow, and his mother Hagar provided an Egyptian marriage for him. The Bible mentions that Ishmael had 12 sons. These are considered ancestors of various Arab tribes. The biblical verse that deals with this phase of Ishmael's life in Genesis quotes, "God was with the boy while he grew up. He lived in the desert of Paran and became an archer. His mother chose a wife for him in the land of Egypt." On the other hand, the promises made to the descendants of Isaac are equally impactful. God promised to these that his offspring would become a great nation and would inherit the promised land. This promise is crucial in the context of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, as it is associated with the formation of the people of Israel and divine revelation throughout the Old Testament. At the height of his 40 years, Isaac, son of Abraham, embarked on a journey of love and faith by uniting with Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, a union guided by divine designs, tracing the first steps of a lineage destined to mold sacred history. However, the couple's happiness encountered a challenge in the form of sterility that involved Rebekah's heart. Confronting this obstacle, Isaac directed his prayers to the Lord in favor of his beloved wife. In an expression of deep faith, he elevated his longings to the heavens, trusting in divine providence to overcome the barrier of infertility that afflicted them. The answers to Isaac's prayers did not take long to arrive, and Rebekah became pregnant. The miracle of life pulsed in her womb, revealing the divine presence that molded them from the maternal womb. However, during the gestation, the baby shook inside her, which caused her concern. One day, she questioned God. Why this is happening to me? God promptly responds, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will separate from your bowels. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." In this divine revelation, God clarified the deep meaning of the agitation inside her. He reveals that the twins she carries are not just brothers, but represent the beginning of 2 distinct nations. Besides that, God announces that the older, Esau, would serve the younger, Jacob, inverting the traditional order of primogeniture. Thus then, the divine purpose for Esau and Jacob began to unfold in their mother's belly. The expected moment finally arrived when Rebekah gave birth. Esau emerged red and covered with a peculiar fur, while Jacob, holding his brother's heel, announced his entry into the world. The birth of these 2 boys, so distinct in appearance and personality, signaled the fulfillment of the divine promises made to Isaac and Rebekah. As the years passed, the boys grew up. Esau became a skilled hunter. He was Isaac's favorite, while Jacob preferred to stay among the tents and had a closer approach with Rebekah. Isaac, a venerable father, perceived that his journey on earth was about to reach its end. Feeling the urgency to bless his firstborn before leaving, he called for Esau, his oldest son. However, in the shadows of the tent, Rebekah, an astute mother and knowledgeable of divine revelations, heard the conversation between father and son. God, in his wisdom, had revealed to her that the blessing destined would be for Jacob, the younger son. Thus, Rebekah, trusting in the divine promise, elaborated an ingenious plan to ensure the destiny of her son, while Esau, obedient, went in search of prey to please his father. Rebekah instructed Jacob to bring 2 young goats from the flock with skillful hands. She prepared Isaac's favorite dish, taking advantage of Isaac's fragility, who could no longer see due to his advanced age. She instructs Jacob to pass himself off as Esau. The ruse reached its peak when Rebekah covered Jacob's smooth arms with the skin of the goats to simulate Esau's fur. The scene was set when Jacob, initially hesitant, attended to his mother's plan. Before Isaac, disguised as Esau, Jacob received the paternal blessing. Influenced by Rebekah's ability to manipulate the situation, the blessing, full of divine promises, included prosperity, dominion over his brothers, and the power of words that bless and curse. The tragedy unfolded when Esau returned from the hunt and discovered the deception. Consumed by fury, he threatened Jacob's life, fearing for the safety of her son. Rebekah advised Jacob to flee to the house of Laban, his uncle, until Esau's anger dissipated. After leaving his homeland, Jacob undertook a journey that would take him to Haran, where he intended to find his uncle Laban. During his journey, Jacob arrives at a specific place and decides to rest. At nightfall, he uses a stone as a pillow and falls asleep. It was during this sleep that Jacob had an extraordinary dream full of meanings. In the dream, Jacob saw a ladder that extended from earth to heaven, with the angels of God going up and down it. This ladder symbolized the direct connection between heaven and earth, representing the open communication between God and humanity. The presence of the angels going up and down highlights the constant and active nature of this spiritual connection. Besides that, during the dream, God was standing at the top of the ladder, and he addressed Jacob with a special message. He reaffirmed the promises made to Abraham and Isaac, guaranteeing that Jacob's offspring would be vast and blessed, spreading throughout the earth. God also promised to be with Jacob wherever he went and bring him back to that land. When Jacob woke up, he realized the sacred importance of the place where he had rested. He exclaimed, "Without doubt, the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." In recognition of the spiritual experience, Jacob took the stone that had served as his pillow, positioned it as a memorial, poured oil over it as a sign of consecration, and called the place Bethel, which means house of God. Jacob's journey continues, and one day, near a well, Jacob, moved by curiosity, asked the shepherds about their origin. "My brothers, where are you from?" The answer came shortly after. "We are from Haran." In his search for relatives, Jacob asked if they knew Laban, the grandson of Nahor, Abraham's brother. The shepherds not only confirmed that they knew him, but also warned Jacob that Rachel, daughter of Laban, would arrive shortly at the place where they were. While waiting for Rachel, Laban's daughter arrived with her sheep. Full of emotion upon recognizing his relative, Jacob approached, rolled the stone out of the mouth of the well, and gave water to Laban's flock. The meeting led to a deeper revelation of kinship, and Jacob, moved by sincere feelings, kissed Rachel and, moved, poured out tears. Shortly after, Rachel ran to tell her father, Laban, about Jacob's arrival. Laban, upon hearing about the relative, hurried to receive Jacob with warm hugs. Jacob, in his turn, shared his whole story with Laban, who recognized Jacob as a relative and offered him hospitality. Throughout a month, Jacob remained under Laban's roof, the host. Realizing that his relative was willing to work for the good of the family, proposed a deeper alliance. Laban had 2 daughters, Leah, the older, and Rachel, the younger. Of notable beauty, Jacob's heart inclined to Rachel, and he proposed to Laban to work for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. Laban, agreeing to the proposal, witnesses Jacob's tireless efforts during this period, whose love and devotion were like a firm foundation. The expected moment arrived, and Jacob, after 7 years of service, went to Laban to claim his bride. Laban, however, prepared a wedding banquet, and at night, in a festive atmosphere, led Leah, his older daughter, to Jacob, consummating thus the marriage. At dawn, Jacob perceived the deception. The morning light revealed that the woman at his side was not Rachel, but Leah. Surprised and perhaps disappointed, Jacob confronted Laban. Laban, with cunning, explained that it was not custom to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older, justifying thus the exchange. Laban proposed a solution. Jacob could complete the week of the wedding feast with Leah and then would have permission to marry Rachel. However, to ensure this second matrimony, Jacob would have to commit himself to work for another 7 years. In a testimony of resilience and true love, Jacob agreed with the new agreement proposed by Laban. Thus, he completed the week of the feast with Leah and subsequently formalized his union with Rachel. Jacob, moved by his commitment and love, gave himself to another 7 years of hard work for Laban. At the end of this period, Jacob, now married to both sisters, Rachel and Leah, consolidated his family under Laban's roof. During this time, he not only experienced the challenges of complex family relationships, but also prospered in the creation of his own flock. God, in his providence, blessed Jacob's efforts, multiplying the animals under his supervision. However, as Jacob's prosperity grew, the tensions with Laban also intensified. Realizing the need for autonomy and seeking to fulfill the divine promise of returning to his parents' land, Jacob expressed his desire to leave. Laban, realizing that Jacob's presence was a source of blessing for himself, tried to persuade Jacob to remain. However, Jacob, guided by the call of God, remained firm in his decision. Thus, Jacob, accompanied by his wives, children, and flock, undertook the journey back to the land of Canaan. However, this return does not occur without significant fears and challenges. Mainly the fear of facing Esau, his brother, whose anger Jacob had feared for years. Before meeting with Esau, Jacob elaborated an astute plan to appease his brother's possible anger. He decided to send a caravan of gifts, including animals and valuable goods, across the river Jabbok. This offer would be a gesture of reconciliation and an attempt to soften Esau's heart. On the night before the meeting with Esau, Jacob made a crucial decision. He rose, gathered his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, his 2 servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the river Jabbok. Jacob, however, realized that he needed to face his deepest fear and remained on the other bank of the river. It was then that an extraordinary event occurred. A mysterious man appeared and wrestled with Jacob throughout the night. The fight was intense and symbolic, representing the battles and challenges that Jacob would face on his journey. Jacob had struggled his whole life since the moment of his birth, his conflict with Esau, and even the challenges with Laban. Now, upon re-encountering Esau, Jacob faces the most difficult moment of his life. At the height of the fight, in an attempt to end the confrontation, the man touched the joint of Jacob's thigh near the hip, leaving him limping. However, even wounded, Jacob refused to give up, insisting on receiving a blessing. The man then asked Jacob what his name was. Jacob's answer triggered a significant turnaround in the narrative. The man declared, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have wrestled with God and with men and have prevailed." Here, the change of name symbolizes a profound spiritual and identity transformation for Jacob, marking a new chapter in his journey. The man revealed himself as a divine manifestation and granted Jacob a special blessing. Jacob then realized that he had wrestled with God. He called the place Peniel, meaning the face of God. Why? For he had seen God face to face, and yet his life had been preserved. This transformative experience left Jacob with a new identity and a renewed perspective. At dawn, Jacob, limping because of the joint of the thigh touched during the fight, continued on his journey. We reach the culminating point of the story of Jacob and Esau, where the much-feared meeting between the brothers approaches. The tension hangs in the air, loaded by Esau's previous threat to kill Jacob. Jacob, conscious of the delicacy of the situation, takes a measure of humility and submission. He bows 7 times before Esau, a symbolic gesture of respect and submission, demonstrating the depth of his desire for reconciliation. Surprisingly, Esau does not respond with hostility, as many might expect. Instead, he runs toward Jacob, embraces him, and cries. The scene is powerful, marking the long-awaited reconciliation between the brothers. The bitterness of the past seems to fade before the genuine expression of forgiveness and brotherly love. Despite the reunion, Jacob and Esau decide to follow separate paths. Jacob settles in Succoth, where he builds a house and shelters for his cattle. This phase of stability symbolizes not only Jacob's material security, but also the peace reached after years of uncertainty and conflict. He fathered 12 children who became the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. This notable offspring includes prominent figures like Joseph, whose story drew a crucial role in the biblical narrative. Joseph was a biblical character of the Old Testament, son of Jacob and Rachel, and one of the 12 children of Jacob, known as the children of Israel. Joseph was favored by his father, Jacob, which generated jealousy among his brothers. Besides that, Joseph had dreams that indicated his future position of leadership over his brothers, which intensified the envy of him. In a crucial event, Jacob sent Joseph to check on the well-being of his brothers, who were pasturing the flock far from home. When the brothers saw Joseph approaching, they conspired to kill him. However, Reuben, the oldest brother, suggested that they throw him into a cistern instead of killing him, with the intention of later rescuing him. Reuben planned to save Joseph from his brothers and return him to his father. While Joseph was in the cistern, a group of Ishmaelite merchants passed by the location. Judah, another brother of Joseph, proposed selling him as a slave to these merchants. The brothers agreed, and Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph then is taken to Egypt, and subsequently he is bought by Potiphar, an Egyptian official and captain of Pharaoh's guard. The Bible does not provide detailed information about Potiphar's origins, but the account in Genesis mentions that he was an Egyptian official, captain of Pharaoh's guard, and possibly had ascended to power through his skills and loyal services to the Egyptian court. The title of minister, attributed to Potiphar, indicates his position as an advisor or a high official in the royal court. He was not just a military official, but also someone of great trust of Pharaoh. Besides that, there is an alternative interpretation of the word minister that suggests that Potiphar could have played the role of executioner, responsible for carrying out Pharaoh's orders, especially in relation to the prisoners. His strategic position as captain of the guard and minister reveals a character who played a crucial role in the administration and the application of Pharaoh's decisions. In Potiphar's house, Joseph quickly demonstrates exceptional skills and is promoted to administrator of everything that Potiphar possessed. The narrative highlights Joseph's prosperity under Potiphar's supervision, indicating the trust that Potiphar placed in him. The Bible also mentions the notable beauty of Joseph that attracts the attention of Potiphar and his wife. The story takes a dramatic turn when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. However, Joseph refuses her advances, remaining faithful to his moral and ethical principles. Potiphar's wife, frustrated by the rejection, falsely accuses Joseph of attempted rape. This false accusation leads to Joseph's imprisonment, where he remains in jail for a period. Even being unjustly imprisoned, Joseph continues to demonstrate his exceptional skills, interpreting the dreams of other inmates. One day, two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the baker, had separate dreams, and both were disturbed by the meaning of their visions. Joseph, known for his ability to interpret dreams, perceived the anguish of the two men and offered to help. In the cupbearer's dream, he saw a vine with 3 branches. The vine blossomed, produced grapes, and he squeezed the juice into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interpreted the dream as a sign of restoration. Within 3 days, the chief cupbearer would be restored to his position and would return to serving Pharaoh. As for the baker, he dreamed of 3 baskets of bread on his head. In the highest basket, there were confectionery products destined for Pharaoh, but birds ate those products. Joseph's interpretation was somber. In 3 days, the baker would be executed, and the birds would eat his flesh. Both interpretations proved to be accurate, and the events occurred exactly as Joseph had foreseen. The chief cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker was executed, as the dreams indicated, despite Joseph's predictions having materialized. The chief cupbearer, upon being re-established, forgets to fulfill his promise to present Joseph to Pharaoh. So, Joseph remains in prison for some time longer, facing more challenges. However, his ability to interpret dreams continues to impress. Eventually, Pharaoh has an intriguing dream that disturbs his advisors. The chief cupbearer remembers Joseph and his unique ability. So, Joseph is brought into Pharaoh's presence to interpret the dream, and he reveals that the dream is a message from God about an imminent shortage of food in the region. The message said, "Behold, there come 7 years of great abundance throughout the land of Egypt. But after them shall arise 7 years of famine, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will consume the land, and the abundance will not be known in the land because of that famine that will follow. For it will be very severe." In this passage, Joseph explains to Pharaoh that the dreams represent 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of scarcity, and that God is revealing the future to prepare Egypt for the period of famine that is approaching. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh elevates him to a position of leadership, making him governor of Egypt. Joseph is in charge of supervising the collection and distribution of food during the 7 years of abundance foreseen in his dream. His efficient administration allows Egypt to store food to face the 7 subsequent years of famine. In this context, Pharaoh decides to intervene, making the union of Joseph with Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar. Joseph, despite having been born and raised in Jacob's house, an environment of faith and tradition, does not abstain from marrying Asenath, an Egyptian woman. Pharaoh's strategy to neutralize possible problems with Potiphar or Potipharah plays a crucial role in this choice. By marrying Joseph to the daughter of Potiphar, Pharaoh effectively binds Joseph to Potiphar's family, thus preventing Potiphar from making any harmful accusation against Joseph or trying to harm him in any way. This strategic measure aims to ensure that Joseph remains in his position of leadership without facing obstacles from Potiphar or his wife, who had previously falsely accused him. Joseph accepts the marriage without contesting. After all, upon becoming a leader in Egypt, he realized the need to establish alliances and ensure stability in his position. Marrying the daughter of an Egyptian priest may have been a strategy to ensure support and acceptance within Egyptian society. Due to the famine in the land of Canaan, where Jacob's family was living, Joseph, who was now an important figure in the Egyptian government, invited his family to move to Egypt, where they would have access to food and sustenance. Jacob and his sons accepted the offer and settled in the region of Goshen, a fertile area of Egypt. Upon moving to Egypt, Jacob's family was able to survive the famine and preserve their offspring. This event was part of the fulfillment of the divine promise made to Abraham that his offspring would be numerous. The saga of the patriarchs seeks to highlight the family relationships, the human complexities, and divine faithfulness in fulfilling his promises through generations. Each step of this journey molded the scenery for future events, preparing the ground for the continuous revelation of God's plan in the history of his people. The Exodus and desert. The epic narrative of the Exodus and the journey through the desert reveal not only the inspiring leadership of Moses, but also the powerful intervention of God in favor of his people, thus molding the identity of the nation of Israel. The story of Moses begins with the narrative of the Israelites, descendants of Jacob, who multiplied in Egypt and were subjected to slavery by Pharaoh. Concerned with the growth of the Hebrew population and fearing that they could become a threat, Pharaoh issued a cruel order. He ordered that all Hebrew midwives kill the male babies at the moment of birth, throwing them into the Nile River. In this context, Moses was born. His mother, Jochebed, and his father, Amram, hid him and placed the basket in the waters of the Nile near the bank. Pharaoh's daughter, who was in the river to bathe, found the basket. Upon seeing the Hebrew baby, she was taken by compassion and decided to adopt him as her own son. Miriam, Moses' sister, who was observing from afar, offered to call a Hebrew mother to breastfeed the baby. Thus, Jochebed was authorized to take care of Moses, her own son, while he grew up in Pharaoh's court. Thus, Moses grew up in the luxurious corridors of the Egyptian court, experiencing a privileged education and acquiring a unique understanding of the complexities of Egyptian society. However, even amidst the luxury of the palace, Moses never forgot his Hebrew roots. Moses' life took a monumental turnaround. When Moses was already an adult, he witnessed the oppression of his Israelite brothers by the Egyptians. In an incident, seeing an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew, Moses became angry and killed the Egyptian, opting to renounce the riches of royalty and fearing the consequences of his act. Moses fled to the desert to escape Pharaoh's anger. In the desert, Moses took refuge in the region of Midian, where he met the priest named Jethro. There, he married Zipporah, daughter of Jethro, and became a shepherd of sheep. Moses' life in the desert contrasted drastically with the wealth and luxury he had experienced in the Egyptian court. This apparently contradictory transition, in the eyes of the world, was orchestrated by divine will. God molded Moses during his years of shepherding, preparing him for the mission that awaited him. Moses' trajectory from Pharaoh's court to the vast horizons of the desert is a testimony of divine providence and the faithfulness of those who submit themselves to the will of God. Moses spent 40 years taking care of sheep in the desert before returning to live among the Israelites. During his journey in the desert, Moses had several encounters with God, revealing a singular divine relationship that would mold the destiny of a people. One of these extraordinary moments occurred on Mount Horeb, when Moses came across a burning bush that surprisingly was not consumed by fire. Upon approaching the bush, Moses heard the voice of God speaking directly to him. This divine manifestation through the burning bush was a supernatural way of calling Moses' attention and indicating that God was present at that sacred moment. Initially, Moses resisted the divine call, feeling inadequate for the grandiose mission proposed by God. His reluctance reflected the limited understanding of his own skills and the magnitude of the task ahead of him. However, God, in his infinite wisdom, reassured Moses, revealing his sacred name. "I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses covered his face because he feared to look at God. This divine guarantee not only dissipated Moses' doubts, but also conferred a celestial authority to his mission. This episode marked the beginning of Moses' call to lead the Israelites in the liberation of Egypt. The burning bush is, therefore, a significant symbol in the biblical tradition, representing the holiness of God, his ability to manifest himself in extraordinary ways, and the divine call for a specific mission. Upon returning to Egypt, Moses and Aaron, his older brother, presented themselves before Pharaoh, requesting the liberation of the Hebrew people. However, Pharaoh resisted, and instead of liberating the Israelites, increased the workload on them. God then initiated a series of plagues on Egypt to demonstrate his power and force the liberation. The plagues included transforming the river water into blood, infestation of frogs, lice, flies, pestilence on the animals, ulcers, hailstone storm, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn. After each plague, Pharaoh promised to liberate the people but always changed his mind. As the plagues ravaged Egypt, Pharaoh's resistance in liberating the Israelites remained unshaken. God, determined to liberate his people, announced the last and most devastating plague, the death of the firstborn. This would be the final blow that would induce Pharaoh to yield. Moses, obeying the divine instructions, announced the imminence of the 10th plague. God instructed the Israelites to mark the doors of their houses with the blood of a lamb. On the designated night, the angel of death would pass through Egypt. But where there was blood on the doors, he would pass by that house without causing harm. At midnight, it brought a deep and silent darkness, interrupted only by the wailing in the Egyptian houses. From Pharaoh's palace to the humble dwellings, the plague reached all families, taking the life of the firstborn in each home that was not protected by the blood. Weeping and affliction echoed through the streets, while Pharaoh, struck by personal loss, finally yielded. Amidst the sadness and urgency, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, instructing them to leave immediately with the Israelites. The Egyptian nation was tired of the horrors inflicted by the plagues, and Pharaoh, confronted with the death of his own son, could no longer bear the presence of the Hebrews in his territory. Thus, after years of servitude and a prolonged exile, the Israelites, led by Moses, began their journey to freedom, in charge of leading more than 2 million slaves out of Egypt. Moses assumed a crucial role in the execution of the divine plan of liberation. In the desert, Moses guided the Israelites through diverse challenges, facing the shortage of water, hunger, and confrontations with other nations. God provided manna from heaven and water from the rock to sustain them. Moses also went up to Mount Sinai, where he received the 10 Commandments and other laws to guide the people. Moses' leadership was marked by challenges, but his faithfulness to God and the leading of the Israelites out of Egypt consolidated his position as one of the great biblical leaders. Moses was designated to be not only a political leader, but also a spiritual conductor, guiding the people chosen by God toward liberation and the promise of the Promised Land. Besides that, Moses, anointed by God, was an instrument of powerful miracles recorded in the sacred pages. Among the notable miracles performed by Moses stands out the division of the waters of the Red Sea. One day, while fleeing from the Egyptian army, Moses and the Israelites come across the Red Sea before them, preventing them from continuing the escape. It was at this crucial moment that God ordered Moses to extend his hand over the sea. In an act of faith, Moses obeyed, and the waters began to separate miraculously, forming two walls of water on both sides, leaving a dry path in the middle. This path became the escape route for the Israelites, providing them with a miraculous passage through the waters. While the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, the waters remained firm, protecting them from the Egyptian army that tried to pursue them. However, when the Egyptians ventured into the middle of the sea, the waters returned to their normal course, sinking and destroying the enemy army. Another striking miracle would occur shortly after. After crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites, led by Moses, walked through the desert toward the Promised Land. After days of journey, they arrived at Marah. However, they discovered that the local waters were bitter and unfit for consumption. The disappointment and the imminent need for drinking water shook the people's confidence. It was at this challenging moment that Moses, guided by God, took an action apparently simple but loaded with meaning. He threw a piece of wood into the bitter waters of Marah, and immediately a miracle occurred. The bitter waters were transformed into sweet and potable waters, providing relief and renewal for the thirsty Israelites. The choice of the wood as an instrument to perform this miracle is symbolic in the biblical tradition. The wood often represents redemption and healing. This action of Moses not only resolved the immediate need for water, but also transmitted a deeper message about the capacity to transform bitter situations into renewing and restoring experiences. In diverse situations, Moses and Aaron, the leaders designated by God, were confronted by the Israelites who, in their thirst and despair, questioned divine leadership. In moments of despair, some slaves argued that it would have been better to remain in Egypt, where at least they would have water for their thirst. The tension and dissatisfaction reached its peak in Meribah. In response to the people's complaint, God instructed Moses to speak to a rock, and it would provide water for the thirsty people. Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the community before them. Order the rock to give its water, and you will draw water from it for the community and for their flocks. However, instead of speaking to the rock, Moses became irritated with the murmuring of the people, and in his emotional exhaustion, struck the rock with his staff. Although the water had flowed from the rock, this action resulted in a significant consequence for Moses. God rebuked Moses for not having trusted in his word and for having acted with anger before the people. Because you did not trust in me to manifest my holiness before the Israelites, you will not introduce this community into the land that I give them. As a result, Moses and Aaron were prohibited from entering the Promised Land, a severe punishment for the disobedience at that critical moment. The incident in Meribah serves as a reminder in the biblical narrative about the importance of unshakable trust in God. Even in the most challenging circumstances, Moses, although he had led the Israelites with great faith and courage, experienced the consequences of his lack of trust, specifically at that crucial moment. Moses' death is shrouded in mystery and singularity, revealing a unique episode in the biblical narrative. According to the scriptures, Moses climbed Mount Nebo, from where he contemplated the vision of the Promised Land before his passing. The account is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land from Gilead to Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the region of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zor. And the Lord said to him, This is the land that I promised under oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, And I will give it to your offspring. I made you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross over there. Thus Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And God buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and no one has known to this day the place of his burial. Although Moses did not enter the promised land physically, his role as leader and legislator left a lasting legacy. His death marked the end of an era and the transition of command to Joshua, who would lead the Israelites in the conquest of the promised land. The conquest of the promised land. The conquest of the promised land, led by Joshua after the death of Moses, is an exciting saga that highlights the courageous leadership of Joshua, as also the challenges faced by the people of Israel while they sought to establish themselves in the land that God had promised. Joshua, a dedicated disciple of Moses, was chosen by God to lead the Israelites beyond the Jordan and lead the military campaign to take possession of the promised land. His commitment to the divine will and his unshakable faith made him a central figure in this crucial chapter of Israelite history. However, before the effective entry into the land, a striking episode highlighted the tension between faith and disbelief. Joshua sent 12 spies to explore the land of Canaan. Although the land was abundant and fertile, most of the spies returned with a fearful account, highlighting the cities and the apparently insurmountable fortresses of the Canaanite cities. Only Joshua and Caleb maintained a confident perspective in God's ability to deliver the promised land. The disbelief of the people, influenced by the negative report of most of the spies, resulted in significant consequences. God, in his justice, determined that that doubting generation would not enter the promised land. Thus, for 40 years, the Israelites wandered in the desert, learning lessons of trust and total dependence on God. Finally, under the leadership of Joshua, the conquest of the promised land began in a gradual and strategic way. Cities like Jericho, known for its formidable walls, fell before the divinely inspired plans. Each victory, despite the challenges, confirmed God's faithfulness to his promise and strengthened the people's trust in Joshua as the designated leader. The gradual conquest of the promised land not only symbolized the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also solidified the position of Israel as a people chosen by God. This chapter of biblical history narrates epic events of battles and victories, highlighting the importance of faith, obedience, and unshakable trust in divine providence. The period of the Judges. The period of the Judges. A phase in the history of Israel between the conquest of the Promised Land and the establishment of the monarchy is marked by a repetition of cycles that reveal the spiritual instability of the people and their tendency to disobey God. During this time, the Israelites entered a series of periods of apostasy in which they distanced themselves from the exclusive worship of God, yielding to idolatrous practices. This path of disobedience led to oppressions by neighboring nations, leading the Israelites to cry out for help. God, in his mercy, raised up judges to liberate the people from oppression and guide them back to the path of obedience. These leaders, inspired by the Holy Spirit, played crucial roles during the turbulent periods of the Judges. Among them stands out Gideon, the fearless leader who, despite his initial reluctance, led the Israelites to victory against the Midianites. In this battle, God instructs Gideon to reduce his army considerably to demonstrate that the victory would be a divine work. With a small group of men, Gideon defeats the Midianites through an ingenious strategy involving torches and pitchers during the night. The victory is achieved in a notable way, and Gideon becomes a judge of Israel for 40 years. Jephthah, another judge, faced personal challenges and led the Israelites against their enemies. Samson was also a judge of Israel, and his story is fantastic. Samson was born miraculously from a woman named Manoah, who was sterile. One day, an angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah and announced the birth of Samson, instructing that he be consecrated as a Nazirite from birth, abstaining from wine and avoiding contamination with impure things. Samson grew up and, with the Spirit of the Lord upon him, demonstrated extraordinary physical strength. Samson, despite being a Nazirite, got involved romantically with a Philistine woman named Delilah. Delilah, a Philistine woman, enters the story as Samson's great love. However, unlike true love, his interest in Samson was motivated by greed and loyalty to his nation. The Philistine leaders approached Delilah in search of help to discover the source of Samson's supernatural strength, which represented a threat to their dominion. Delilah, aware of her influence over Samson, decides to use her charms to discover the secret of his strength. She initiates a series of interactions with Samson. The plot involves Delilah questioning Samson relentlessly to find the source of his strength. Each time, Samson gives her deceptive answers, testing Delilah's trust and loyalty. The story reaches a critical point when Delilah, persistent in her search, finally leads Samson to reveal the truth about his strength, which is linked to his Nazirite vow, including the abstention from cutting his hair. With this crucial information, Delilah betrays Samson, cutting his hair while he sleeps. Delilah's betrayal leads to Samson's capture by the Philistines, who blind him and place him in chains. However, the story does not end there. Samson, despite his blindness and condition as a prisoner, invokes divine help, recovering his strength one last time. At the culminating moment, Samson knocks down the columns of the Philistine temple, sacrificing himself to defeat his enemies. Delilah's story serves as a warning about the dangers of manipulation, betrayal, and misplaced trust. Her search for personal gain and loyalty to her nation results in Samson's fall and, eventually, in her own ruin. Besides these leaders, Samuel emerged as a prominent figure during the end of the period of the Judges. His story also deserves prominence. Elkanah was a man with two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Hannah, the sterile wife, was deeply saddened by not having children. While Peninnah had children, annually, the family went to the sanctuary of Shiloh to worship God. In one of these visits to Shiloh, Hannah was so distressed by her infertility that she prayed fervently to the Lord, promising to dedicate her son to God if he blessed her with a child. God heard Hannah's pleas, and she conceived a son. She called him Samuel, which means request to God. After Samuel's weaning, Hannah fulfilled her promise and took him to the sanctuary in Shiloh, delivering him to serve the Lord under the care of the priest Eli. Samuel grew up in the sanctuary of Shiloh, where he learned to serve God under Eli's tutelage. God called Samuel to be a prophet from a young age, and he became one of the most prominent leaders and judges of Israel. As a judge of Israel, his role, recorded in the book of Judges, highlights not only his wisdom, but also his deep trust in divine power. Deborah emerges as a leader at a moment when Israel was being oppressed by the Canaanites, specifically by the enemy commander Sisera. The people of Israel cried out to God for help, and God answered through Deborah, who acted as a spiritual leader and judicial ruler. Deborah demonstrated a deep faith in God, and her role as a prophetess suggests an intimate connection with divine guidance. She summoned Barak, an Israelite military leader, to lead the troops in the battle against Sisera. Besides prophesying the victory over Sisera, Deborah warned that the glory of the victory would be credited to a woman, not to Barak. After the battle led by Barak and Deborah against Sisera, Sisera fled from the battlefield toward the tent of Jael, who was a Kenite woman. Sisera sought refuge in Jael's tent, as he was familiar with the Kenites and expected to find shelter there. Jael welcomed him, offering him milk to drink and a blanket to rest. While Sisera was sleeping, Jael took the opportunity to act. She took a tent peg and, with great courage and decision, hammered it into Sisera's temple, driving it into the ground. This act resulted in Sisera's death. Jael's act of killing Sisera fulfilled Deborah's prophecy that the glory of the victory would not be credited to Barak, but to a woman. The battle resulted in the defeat of the Canaanites and the liberation of Israel. Deborah expressed her gratitude to God for his intervention with a hymn of praise that is recorded in the book of Judges, chapter 5, known as the Song of Deborah. If you are enjoying the content, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button to receive more content like this. The period of the Judges is characterized by the dynamic interaction between the infidelity of Israel, divine discipline, and the gracious provision of God through designated leaders. The phase in the history of Israel prepared the ground for the transition to the era of the kings, a new phase in the journey of the people of God. The monarchy. The period of the monarchy in Israel was marked by events of extreme importance, starting with the people's request for a king, passing through the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon, until the tragic division of the kingdom after Solomon's death. The people's desire for a king was motivated by the observation of other nations around them that had monarchs. Although this decision was accepted by God as a reflection of the will of the people, it also evidenced a certain lack of trust in God as their supreme ruler. God, respecting the choice of the people, granted them a king, and Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel. Saul's reign was marked by notable successes, like the victory over the Amalekites, but also by failures, including disobedience to divine instructions. Subsequently, David, a young shepherd anointed by Samuel, was chosen by God as king. Everything starts in Bethlehem, a small city of Judah where a simple family lived. David, a young shepherd, found in his sheep not just a flock, but also a divine school. In the verdant fields, he learned the art of leading, protecting, and nourishing. His courage was forged in defense against the threats that roamed. With his harp in hands, he found in the songs he sang for his sheep an intimate connection with the divine. Jesse, David's father, was a man who feared God. When the prophet Samuel was sent by God to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse presented his sons before him. However, God did not choose the older sons of Jesse, who were strong and impressive to human eyes. Instead, God instructed Samuel to anoint the youngest of Jesse, the young shepherd David. David was a man according to God's heart, not because of his external appearance, but because of his obedient heart and his unshakable faith. Even being the youngest and least notable in the eyes of men, God saw something special in David. It was then, at that moment, that Samuel heard the divine voice. It is this. The oil of the anointing flowed over David's head, not only consecrating him as king, but marking him as the chosen one of God. There, in the fields that witnessed his humility, David received a divine mission. Thus, David began his journey, carrying with him not just a shepherd's staff, but the divine anointing that would guide his steps to the throne of Israel at this time. The Philistines and the Israelites were in conflict over territorial issues, power disputes, and historical rivalries between these two peoples. Sometime later, the situation reached its peak when the Philistines gathered their army and prepared to face the Israelites. The two armies were camped in opposite positions, with a valley between them. The Philistines had Goliath, a giant warrior, as their champion, and he challenged the Israelites to send a representative to fight against him in a singular combat. The proposal was that if Goliath won, the Israelites would surrender. If the Israelite representative won, the Philistines would surrender. This singular challenge had the objective of avoiding a large-scale conflict, saving lives, and deciding the battle in a more efficient way. Goliath, besides his physical imposition, provoked the Israelites with insults, mocking their faith and courage. However, the Israelite soldiers were apprehensive, and none of them dared to face this formidable giant. However, in the heart of the unthinkable, David presented himself as a volunteer, far from the pompous armors of the soldiers. He chose to face the giant with a sling, 5 stones, and, above all, an unshakable faith in God. King Saul, perplexed, questioned the young shepherd's choice, but David proclaimed trust in his experience as a shepherd, where he had already faced lions and bears to protect his sheep. He did not fear Goliath, for he trusted in something greater than his own skills. The day of the battle arrived, and while Goliath advanced, David ran toward the giant, with a single stone launched, guided by the divine hand. The trajectory of history changed. Goliath, the giant invincible in the eyes of men, fell defeated. The victory did not belong to physical strength, but to the fearless faith of a young shepherd who trusted in the living God. What started as a story of admiration and triumph eventually unfolded into a drama loaded with jealousy, betrayal, and, surprisingly, an unshakable friendship. King Saul, once anointed by God to lead Israel, found in David a brave warrior and military leader. However, as David's victories accumulated and his popularity grew, a shadow of discontent took hold of Saul's heart. What could have been a relationship of mentorship and cooperation transformed into envy and fear of the success of the young anointed one. The turning point came when the women of Israel sang, "Saul struck his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Samuel chapter 18, verse 7. This simple melody that celebrated the achievements of both leaders triggered an uncontrollable fury in Saul's heart. From that moment, the shadow of envy obscured his vision and altered the course of his relationship with David. Saul, consumed by paranoia and jealousy, began to plan David's death. He tried to throw a spear against him, while David played the harp to calm the torment of the king, sent him to dangerous battles in the hope that he would fall into the hands of the enemies. But despite all of Saul's efforts, David continued to prosper, protected by God's hand. While Saul and David's relationship crumbled, an unexpected friendship flourished. Jonathan, son of Saul, fell in love with David's courage and character. This friendship flourished amidst Saul's growing hostility toward David. Jonathan, in an act of courage and loyalty, warned David about his father's nefarious plans. The friendship between David and Jonathan became a bastion of hope and emotional support. Even when Saul was determined to destroy David, Jonathan remained by his friend's side, willing to sacrifice his own position to protect the one he knew to be chosen by God. Their story reaches its peak when Jonathan recognizes that God had chosen David to be the next king, not himself. This recognition reveals an extraordinary humility and attachment. For Jonathan accepted the role that God had destined for David, instead of holding on to the power and position that he would naturally have as heir to the throne. Later, during a battle against the Philistines in the region of Mount Gilboa, King Saul would face his tragic death. Jonathan, the apparent heir to the throne, also fell side by side with his father. With the death of Saul and Jonathan, David finally ascended to the throne of Israel. He did not rush to assume the throne, but sought divine guidance. David's lament for the loss of Saul and Jonathan is recorded in a poem that captured the complexity of his emotions. The noble are slain on the heights. Jonathan lies mortally wounded. Distressed for you, my brother Jonathan, you were beloved and dear to me. Your friendship for me was more extraordinary than the love of women. Samuel 1, chapter 1, verse 25. David stood out as a skillful military leader. His victorious campaigns expanded the borders of Israel and consolidated his position as a respected king. However, the most significant of his achievements was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. With fervent compassion for the worship of God, David wished to bring the divine presence to the capital of Israel. The Ark was located in Kiriath Jearim, after having been captured by the Philistines during a conflict with the Israelites, and remained in their possession for some time. The Ark of the Covenant, also known as the Ark of the Pact, was a sacred object mentioned in the Bible, mainly in the Old Testament. Inside the Ark were placed the 10 Commandments, the stone tablets on which were written the moral principles given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. The Ark also contained a vase with manna, the bread that God provided miraculously to the Israelites during their journey in the desert, and Aaron's rod that blossomed as a sign of his choice as high priest. The Ark of the Covenant had a profound spiritual meaning for the Israelites, as it represented the presence of God among his people and symbolized the covenant between God and Israel. And David, with joy and celebration, brought the Ark to Jerusalem, dancing before it with humility and devotion. This event not only symbolized the centrality of worship in David's life, but also marked Jerusalem as the city chosen by God. Amidst the laurels of his military victories and achievements as king, David, anointed by God, saw himself plunged into a somber episode that shook the foundations of his life. The incident involved Bathsheba, wife of Uriah, one of David's brave warriors. Upon contemplating Bathsheba while she was bathing, David yielded to temptation and committed adultery with her. This act, permeated by lust and selfishness, triggered a chain of events that would change the course of David's life and would deeply affect his relationship with God. Bathsheba became pregnant as a result of this encounter, and the plot complicated even more when David tried to cover up his sin. Upon perceiving Bathsheba's pregnancy, David, in an effort to disguise the adultery, tried to bring Uriah, who was in battle, back home, hoping that he would lie with his wife and thus cover the true paternity of the child. However, Uriah, a man of integrity, refused to enjoy the comfort of home while his companions were on the battlefield. Faced with this loyalty, David, in an act of despair, sent Uriah to the front line of the battle, where he was deliberately placed in danger and ended up being killed. David recognized his guilt and sin before God. His frailty and lamentation are demonstrated in Psalm 51, a poem of deep repentance where David cries out for mercy and divine forgiveness. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Blot out my transgressions according to the multitude of your mercies. Psalm 51. God, in his grace, responded to David's sincere repentance, forgiving his sins, but the earthly consequences still manifested themselves. The child resulting from the adultery died, and David's house was marked by family conflicts and instability. At the height of his reign, when David had already faced battles, built Jerusalem, and consolidated the kingdom of Israel, He found himself before a crucial moment, already old and weakened. David, taking consciousness of his own mortality and guided by divine direction, perceived that the moment had arrived to transfer the covenant promise to the next generation. The account of this moment is recorded in the book of 1 Kings. Chapter 2. David summoned his son Solomon, who was about to succeed him as king, and shared with him the importance of the covenant that God had established. David remembered the divine promise that a descendant of his would govern perpetually over Israel, highlighting the responsibility and the grandiosity of this mission. David's death is recorded in the Old Testament in the book of 1 Kings. The biblical narrative does not provide specific details about the cause of David's death, but indicates that he died at an advanced age after a long reign. In his last moments, David called his son Solomon and gave him final instructions and wise counsels. These instructions included orientations on how Solomon should govern and treat certain people in his kingdom. Solomon's ascension to the throne of Israel occurred in a context marked by challenges and family intrigues. After David's death, his son Adonijah tried to assume the throne, but the prophetic intervention of Nathan and Bathsheba ensured that Solomon, the one chosen by God, was crowned king. God's revelation to David, in which it was said that Solomon would replace him and build the temple in Jerusalem, occurs in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 22, with God saying the following: "You have shed much blood and have made great wars. You will not build a temple in my honor, for you have shed much blood on the ground before me. However, you will have a son who will be a man of peace and tranquility. I will give him tranquility from all his enemies around. His name will be Solomon, and I will give peace and rest to Israel during his reign." Solomon, known for the meaning of his name, which translates as peace, it began his reign promoting stability and unity in the kingdom. The most prominent characteristic of Solomon that highlighted him among the leaders of his time was his extraordinary wisdom. Solomon made a significant covenant with God during the first days of his reign, a moment that evidences not only his wisdom, but also his intention to seek divine guidance in his government. This covenant and its conditions are documented in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 3 to 14. The key event happened in Gibeon, where Solomon offered sacrifices before the Lord. That night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "Ask me what you want me to give you." In response, Solomon expressed his humility, recognizing the greatness of the responsibility of leading the people of Israel, and in particular, mentioned his need for wisdom to judge and govern with justice. He recognized the absolute dependence on God to guide his steps and take wise decisions that would benefit the people of Israel. Solomon's choice in asking for wisdom instead of riches or personal success demonstrated his desire to lead with integrity and justice, reflecting the heart of a wise and God-fearing leader. God's answer to Solomon's plea was striking. God praised the king's choice, and besides granting the wisdom that Solomon asked for, also promised additional blessings, including riches and honor that would be incomparable in the entire history of Israel. A famous episode that illustrates this wisdom is the judgment of the two women who disputed the maternity of a child. The narrative found in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 16 to 22, describes two women who lived together and gave birth at the same time. However, one of the children died, leading both women to claim the surviving child as being their own. Before this impasse, the women appeared before King Solomon in search of justice. Instead of taking a hasty decision, Solomon proposed an extraordinary solution. He suggested dividing the child in half and giving half to each woman. The response of each woman revealed the true mother. The woman who genuinely loved the child begged the king not to harm the child and, instead, suggested that the child be given to the other woman. The other woman, who was not the biological mother, agreed with the division proposal. Solomon's astute response revealed the true mother, the woman who was willing to give up the child to protect her from harm. Solomon then proclaimed that the true mother was the one who had demonstrated genuine maternal love and ordered that the child be delivered to her. Besides his wisdom, Solomon also became known for his notable achievements, including the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem. This grandiose project not only served as the spiritual center of the kingdom, but also symbolized the continuous presence of God among the people of Israel. The grandiosity of the temple demonstrated not only Solomon's administrative ability, but also the wealth and prosperity of the kingdom. The desire to build a temple dedicated to the Lord was initially conceived by his father, King David. However, it was Solomon who carried forward this noble project. The biblical narrative describes intricate details and precious materials, like cedar of Lebanon for the structure and pure gold for adornments, were used in the construction of the temple, reflecting the king's dedication and reverence toward God. The place chosen for the temple, Mount Moriah, had a deep symbolic meaning, being the same place where Abraham demonstrated his faith by being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. This act of faith and obedience that preceded the temple highlighted the continuity of the special relationship between God and his people. Solomon's temple became the spiritual and cultural epicenter of Israel, a symbol of unity and worship. Solomon also dedicated himself to international alliances, solidifying commercial and diplomatic relations. The visit of the Queen of Sheba, who came to test Solomon's wisdom, is a notable example of these external relations. These events were recorded in the First Book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 1 to 13, and in the Second Book of Chronicles, chapter 9, verses 1 to 12. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, the Queen of Sheba presented Solomon with difficult questions, testing his wisdom. The Bible reports that Solomon answered all her questions, and there was nothing he could not explain. The queen's journey to Jerusalem was marked by an impressive caravan carrying an abundance of spices, gold, and precious stones. The exchange of gifts during the visit highlights the diplomatic nature of this meeting. Besides the visit of the Queen of Sheba, Solomon also established diplomatic relations with other kingdoms. He made alliances with princesses of neighboring nations, like Egypt and Phoenicia, a common practice at the time to strengthen alliances and promote peace between the kingdoms. However, throughout his reign, Solomon was not immune to failures. Although Solomon was celebrated for his wisdom and grandiosity, his story is also marked by errors and deviations that eventually had significant consequences in his reign and in the history of Israel. One of Solomon's main deviations was his involvement with foreign women, in disagreement with divine instructions. The Bible reports in the First Book of Kings, chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, that Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, and took for himself princesses of neighboring nations, Shika, contradicting God's law that prohibited marriages with women who worshipped other gods. These marriages were not just political alliances, but also introduced foreign cultural and religious influences in Israel. The foreign wives brought with them their religious practices and gradually exercised a negative influence on Solomon. He began to tolerate the worship of various idols and to participate in rituals that were contrary to the exclusive worship of the God of Israel. The culminating point of this deviation was the construction of temples for the idols in honor of his wives' deities, an act that directly contradicted the commandments given by God. This apostasy, which included the construction of altars for deities like Ashtoreth and Milcom, provoked the anger of God. Solomon's last days, reported in the First Book of Kings, chapters 11 and 12, were marked by a mixture of glory and shadows, revealing the complexities of life and government as Solomon aged. His previous choices, especially in relation to marriages with foreign women and the acceptance of the worship of foreign idols, began to negatively impact his reign. The anger of God manifested itself, and he raised up adversaries against Solomon. Jeroboam, a trusted official, rebelled against the king and became a prominent leader who eventually would become the leader of the northern tribes. Solomon's death would mark the end of an era. He passed away after a reign of 40 years, leaving a legacy that included the majestic construction of the Temple of Jerusalem and a period of peace and prosperity without precedent. The Bible does not provide specific details about the exact cause of Solomon's death. However, in the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verses 41 to 43, the following is recorded. The rest of the history of Solomon, everything he did, and the wisdom he demonstrated is written in the book of the Acts of the Kings of Israel. The days that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel were 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father. After the death of King Solomon, the pages of the history of Israel witnessed a tumultuous and crucial transition. Solomon's reign, known for his wisdom, splendor, and grandiose projects, came to an end, leaving behind a kingdom that experienced both glory and the construction of the temple. And the expansive activities of the kingdom imposed significant taxes and required an extensive workforce. This heavy tax burden and the work requirements began to generate discontent among the tribes and the population in general. The people who initially had admired Solomon for his wisdom now felt the weight of the obligations imposed in the name of royal splendor. The political environment was tense, with growing dissatisfaction among the tribes. Besides that, social issues also played a crucial role. The division between social classes became more pronounced as an elite benefited from Solomon's achievements, while the rest of the population experienced the consequences of government policies. This scenery of discontent and division set the stage for Rehoboam's succession and the crucial decisions that would mold the history of Israel. From now on, we will see the kingdom of Israel crumble. Therefore, I humbly ask you to click the like button and subscribe to help spread our work. Rehoboam, unlike his father, faces a complex scenery. Solomon, known for his wisdom and the grandiosity of the temple he built, left behind a reign that, despite prosperity, generated discontent among the people. The demands imposed to sustain Solomon's monumental achievements became a heavy burden for many. There was a widespread hope that Rehoboam, upon assuming the throne, would take measures to alleviate the excessive demands imposed during the reign of his father. The people desired a leader who would understand their difficulties, a ruler willing to listen and respond to their concerns. At a crucial point of the royal succession, Rehoboam, heir to the throne after Solomon's death, finds himself before an emblematic meeting with the representatives of the people of Israel. This meeting is not just a mere formality, but a decisive moment that will mold the course of the history of the kingdom. The representatives of the people express, certainly, the difficulties faced by the population due to the excessive demands that permeated Solomon's reign, the weight of the tributes, the burden of forced labor, and the growing demands generated widespread discontent. At the critical moment in which Rehoboam is faced with the crucial decision of how to respond to the demands of the people, he finds himself before two different currents of advice. On one side, the wise and experienced elders offer pondered advice grounded in the deep understanding of the kingdom's dynamics. These older counselors, knowledgeable of traditions and political complexities, advise Rehoboam to adopt a posture of understanding in relation to the people. They advise to soften the demands and to demonstrate understanding toward the tribes of Israel. However, on the other side, the young counselors, perhaps driven by the energy of youth and a more immediate vision, suggest an opposite approach. They encourage Rehoboam to adopt a more authoritarian posture, to reinforce the demands, and to show a firmness that could impose respect. The perspective of these younger counselors reflects a less conciliatory approach and more aimed at maintaining control and taxes. Faced with the diverging advice, Rehoboam chooses to follow the suggestion of the young counselors. He opts for an inflexible posture, refusing to alleviate the burdens imposed during Solomon's reign. Rehoboam's refusal to yield to the people's demands results in a wave of discontent that quickly transforms into a rough sea of dissatisfaction. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, cannot tolerate the continuous oppression and the king's refusal to listen to their needs. This tumultuous scenery culminates in Jeroboam's decision to lead the separation of the northern tribes, forming the kingdom of northern Israel, known simply as Israel, after the division of the kingdom. Rehoboam, the king of Judah, took measures to mobilize an army, seeking to regain control over the newly formed northern kingdom led by Jeroboam. However, divine intervention was present in this tense scenery. God, through a clear message, prohibited the southern tribes from proceeding with the military action, instructing that they not fight against their own brothers. Shortly after, God even warned that that division was under his total control, and everything was happening according to his sovereign will. Book of Kings, chapter 12, verse 24. In this context, the first book of Kings also describes that God sent prophets like Ahijah to deliver messages of judgment against Jeroboam and his house due to the apostasy and idolatry of his reign. Prophesying before the emerging leader, Ahijah foresees the rise of the northern kingdom and establishes recommendations for its future. Jeroboam is instructed to lead according to divine principles, with the promise of a lasting dynasty if he obeys. However, disobeying the divine orders would result in serious consequences. However, Jeroboam, leader of the northern kingdom, fearing that his subjects might turn again toward Jerusalem in their religious pilgrimages, takes the unfortunate decision to build altars with golden calves in Bethel and Dan as alternatives of worship. This not only diverts the people from their spiritual traditions centered in Jerusalem, but also introduces idolatry and deviation from true worship. This strategy not only symbolizes political separation, but also establishes a distinct identity for the kingdom of northern Israel. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Judah to the south, Rehoboam faces the consequences of his choices. With the separation, Judah becomes a smaller kingdom centered in Jerusalem, but maintaining the line of David's descendants on the throne. The temple and religious traditions remain under the authority of the southern kingdom, and the Davidic dynasty continues to govern. Although on a reduced scale, the biblical narrative highlights that under Rehoboam's reign, Judah faced challenges and conflicts. The king sought to consolidate power and strengthen Judah's position, but also faced external and internal threats. There were periods of political instability and confrontations with neighboring nations. The Bible does not provide specific details about Rehoboam's death. However, in the second book of Chronicles, it is mentioned that Rehoboam reigned in Jerusalem for 17 years, and after his death, his son Abijah, also known as Abijah, succeeded on the throne of Judah. As for Jeroboam, the Bible does not detail the specific circumstances of his death, but mentions that he reigned for 22 years and passed away. The Book of Kings indicates that Jeroboam slept with his ancestors, and his son Nadab became king in his place. All this configuration of a divided reign in two independent states did not last for a long time. The northern kingdom, led by a succession of kings who often turned away from God's ways, lasted only 2 centuries. Just as Ahijah prophesied to Jeroboam, its collapse occurred in 722 BC, before the onslaught of the Assyrian armies. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was besieged and finally conquered. The people of Israel were taken into exile, scattered among the nations. In their turn, the southern kingdom, known as Judah, faced a similar destiny but at a later moment. Babylon emerged as a conquering power, and in 586, Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, succumbed to Babylonian forces. The temple, central symbol of Jewish worship, was destroyed, and a significant part of the population was taken captive to Babylon. Thus, Rehoboam's unfortunate choice, instead of unifying the tribes under his reign, triggered the division and the future collapse of his kingdom. The history of both Israel and Judah is full of episodes of idolatry, where the people turned to false gods, abandoning the Lord. In response, God sent a series of prophets to warn and call to responsibility. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and Amos highlighted the spiritual and temporal consequences of disobedience. Divine discipline manifested itself through events like foreign invasions, exile, and the destruction of cities. The history of the northern and southern kingdoms would serve as a perpetual reminder of the importance of loyalty to God and the spiritual consequences associated with the choice of disobedience. The Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian captivity represents one of the darkest periods in the history of Israel, marked by the fall of Jerusalem, the exile of the people to Babylon, and, paradoxically, by the notable performance of prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The narrative of the Babylonian captivity begins with the invasion of King Nebuchadnezzar II and his Babylonian troops in Jerusalem. This event culminated in the destruction of the temple and the deportation of the Jewish population to Babylon, an exile that lasted decades. The city that before was the symbol of the divine presence was reduced to rubble, and the people chosen by God were taken captive to a foreign land. Amidst this crisis emerged notable prophets who played crucial roles in guiding and comforting the exiled people. Jeremiah, known as the prophet of tears, who anticipated the imminent destruction of Jerusalem and exhorted the people to accept divine discipline. Daniel, a captive in the Babylonian court, stood out for his faithfulness to God amidst the adversities and his interpretative ability of dreams and visions. And Ezekiel, who was among the exiles, transmitting visions and symbolic messages, emphasizing the importance of repentance and hope in a restored future before the Babylonian exile. Ezekiel exercised his ministry as a priest in the Temple of Jerusalem. However, in 597 BC, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II invaded Jerusalem, he was deported to Babylon together with King Jehoiakim and other leaders. In this context, Ezekiel transitioned from priest to prophet, receiving powerful visions and direct messages from God. During this period, the people of Israel faced the consequences of their disobedience to the covenant with God, known as the Mosaic Covenant, or Covenant of Sinai. This covenant was established when Moses led the people out of Egypt, as recorded in the book of Exodus, specifically in chapters 19 to 24. The Mosaic Covenant was a mutual promise between God and Israel. God granted the Israelites the 10 Commandments and a series of laws to guide their moral, ethical, and ritual conduct. In exchange for obedience to these laws, God promised to bless and protect Israel, making them a special nation among the peoples. However, this covenant also included warnings about the consequences of disobedience. God warned that if the people turned away from his laws, they would face judgments and punishments, including exile and the loss of divine blessings. Throughout history, the Israelites frequently strayed from the covenant. The situation worsened after Solomon's reign, when the United Kingdom of Israel was divided into two distinct parts. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rebelled against the southern kingdom, called Judah, which had as its first king Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. This political and religious division led to a period of instability and idolatry in both kingdoms. The successive kings of these kingdoms were frequently marked by their relationship with God, some seeking faithfulness to the Lord, and others turning away to idolatry and disobedience to the Ten Commandments. The Babylonian exile, in which Jerusalem was destroyed and the people were taken captive, was considered a direct manifestation of the consequences of breaking this covenant. Disobedience to divine laws resulted in divine judgment, and the exile was a reflection of the warnings previously made by God. In this scenery of desolation and despair, Ezekiel was called by God to transmit messages of warning, comfort, and hope to the captive people. He prophesied during approximately 22 years, sharing symbolic visions and impactful discourses. Ezekiel played the crucial role of communicating the divine will, revealing promises of restoration and the importance of repentance for reconciliation with God. The text of Ezekiel, chapter 37, verses 1 to 10, is a powerful narrative that describes a supernatural vision that the prophet Ezekiel had. He reports how the hand of the Lord guided him in spirit to a valley filled with dry bones. This valley represented a scene of desolation and death, symbolizing the desperate condition of the people of Israel during the Babylonian exile. Upon walking through the valley, Ezekiel realizes that the bones were numerous and were completely dry, indicating that these people had been dead for a long time. Then God asks the crucial question to Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel responded with a declaration of deep faith, "Lord God, you know." This answer not only recognizes God's sovereignty, but also expresses an implicit trust in his power over life and death. Ezekiel's faith is evident in the willingness to accept the apparent impossibility of the situation and trust in the divine capacity to perform the extraordinary. His response reflects a faith that transcends the visible circumstances and is based on the certainty of God's omnipotence. Faith is the catalyst that triggers divine intervention, and the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones vividly illustrates how faith can transform apparently hopeless situations. In the Christian life, experiences of revival are intrinsically linked to robust faith that trusts in God's ability to bring life to what seems dead. God then gives a specific instruction to Ezekiel to prophesy over these dry bones and proclaim the word of the Lord. The divine order aims to bring life to that which seems completely hopeless. Ezekiel's prophetic word is directed to the dry bones, calling them to hear the word of the Lord. The divine response is presented in the sequence, where God himself speaks to the dry bones through the prophet. He declares that he will bring life to these bones, making the Spirit enter into them. Here, the term Spirit refers to the divine breath of life, the vitality that comes from God. Ezekiel's willingness to follow divine instructions, even when he did not fully understand the purpose or the final result, is a demonstration of humility, highlighting trust and submission to God. The narrative continues, describing how the bones unite, receive tendons, muscles, and skin, forming complete bodies. However, even after this physical restoration, the bodies were still without life. God then instructs Ezekiel to prophesy over the wind, symbolizing the Spirit of God, to bring the breath of life. The result is notable, for the bodies receive the Spirit, stand up like a great army, and are revivified. It has a profound symbolic meaning, representing the desolate and spiritually dead condition of the people of Israel during the Babylonian exile. This valley filled with dry bones is not just a geographic scenery, but a vivid image of the hopelessness, desolation, and distancing from God that characterizes the nation. Dry bones, as symbolic elements, illustrate the life that is gone. These bones represent the people of Israel in their spiritually dead condition. marked by disobedience to the covenant established with God. The image of the dry bones evokes a sense of abandonment, despair, and absence of life, highlighting the urgent need for divine intervention. The exile, direct result of this disobedience, led the nation to a state of desolation where spiritual vitality was absent. The valley, generally associated with death and contempt, is chosen as the appropriate scenario for this vision, emphasizing the gravity of Israel's spiritual situation. The emergence of tendons, muscles, and skin indicates a complete physical restoration. This represents not only spiritual revitalization, but also the reconstruction of the nation of Israel as a whole. God promises to gather his scattered people, reconstruct what was destroyed, and return integrity to the nation. This vision is deeply symbolic and has implications both for the historical context of the exile and for God's promises of spiritual restoration. It represents God's capacity to bring life to that which is dead, to restore hope even in the most challenging situations, and to revivify the nation of Israel spiritually. The transcendent message is God's promise to transform desolation into renewal and to bring life to those who are spiritually dead. Faced with this challenging scenery, God made an extraordinary promise of restoration. Recorded in verses 5 to 7, "Thus says the Lord, the sovereign, come from the four winds, O Spirit, and breathe upon these dead so that they may live. Prophesy to the Spirit. Prophesy, O Son of Man, and say to it, Dalitao Zanom, thus says the Lord, the Sovereign, come from the four winds, O Spirit, and breathe into the dead so that they may live." See, a crucial part of this promise is the return of the people of Israel to their own land. God declares that he will take them out of the grave, symbolizing the return from the Babylonian exile. This promise is aligned with the previous promises made to Abraham and his descendants of a promised land. It is a testimony of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises despite the transgressions of the people. In the other part of the promise in this passage, God assures that after this restoration, the people will know that he is the Lord. This implies a renewed recognition of divine sovereignty, a deeper understanding of his authority, and a return to true worship. The transformative experience is not only physical and national, but also spiritual, leading the people back to the intimate and reverent knowledge of God. The period of the Babylonian captivity was also marked by a process of spiritual purification, far from their land and the temple. The people of Israel faced an opportunity for reflection and repentance. God, in his mercy, did not abandon his people. Even during the exile, through the prophets, he offered words of comfort, promises of restoration, and instructions to seek the peace of the city where they were exiled. The Babylonian captivity became a season of spiritual revival. The people began to seek God in a more intense way, recognizing the need for repentance and the importance of the covenant with the Lord. This period of purification prepared the ground for the return to the Promised Land and the reconstruction of the temple after the decree of Cyrus, the Persian king. The period of restoration marks a chapter characterized by the return of the people to the Promised Land, the reconstruction of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, the teaching of the law, and a notable spiritual awakening. After decades of Babylonian captivity, the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland. Led by Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the people began the journey back to the Promised Land. This return symbolized not only a physical movement, but also the beginning of a spiritual restoration. One of the first undertakings after the return of the people of Israel was the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Despite the challenges and oppositions, the temple was reconstructed under the leadership of Zerubbabel, marking a spiritual rebirth and the re-establishment of religious practices. Besides that, Ezra, a priest and scribe, played a fundamental role in the teaching and application of the law of Moses. He led a movement to restore the understanding and practice of the law among the people. Ezra promoted the public reading of the law, encouraging repentance and spiritual renewal. The people, upon hearing the law, experienced a deep conviction of sin and sought God in repentance. This resulted in a spiritual renewal, with the people committing themselves to obey and honor God. Nehemiah, in his turn, directed the reconstruction of the walls of Jerusalem, offering protection and security to the city. Despite the adversities, Nehemiah and the people persevered, completing the task in a notable example of cooperation and determination. The story of Nehemiah unfolds in the book of Nehemiah, which is a direct continuation of the book of Ezra. These books present a combined account of the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon and the subsequent reconstruction of Jerusalem, including the temple and its walls. The first mention of Nehemiah occurs when he served as personal cupbearer to the Persian king, Artaxerxes I. The period in which Nehemiah acted as cupbearer is situated during the Persian dominion, more precisely in the 5th century BC. At that time, the Persian Empire exercised control over a vast territorial extension that included the region of Judah and Jerusalem. The position of cupbearer was more than a simple function of serving wine to the king. It was a position of trust and proximity to the monarch. As cupbearer, Nehemiah not only was responsible for ensuring the quality and safety of the drinks served to the king, but also had the opportunity to be in close contact with him. Becoming a trusted advisor, Nehemiah needed to be attentive to details, be discreet, and develop a sensitivity to perceive subtle changes in the king's behavior. His proximity to the monarch provided Nehemiah with an intimate understanding of the challenges and complexities of the government, a valuable vision that would be fundamental in his future undertakings. Besides that, the position of cupbearer to the king placed Nehemiah in contact with diplomatic issues. Since the royal court was frequently the scenery of negotiations and interactions with other peoples and leaders, this environment provided Nehemiah with a practical education in political issues and leadership strategies. In this time, the Persian Empire allowed a certain cultural and religious autonomy in its provinces, including Judah, during this period. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar, many Jews returned from the Babylonian exile as permitted by the edict of King Cyrus. This return was associated with the process of reconstruction of Jerusalem, including the temple and its walls that had been destroyed. On a quiet day in the Persian court, where Nehemiah performed his vital role as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, he received news that triggered a turnaround in his life. A group of visitors from Judah arrived at the court, bringing with them alarming reports about the state of desolation and ruin that ravaged Jerusalem, the city of his ancestors. This account is found in Nehemiah 1, verses 2 and 3, where Nehemiah asks the visitors who came from Judah about the situation in Jerusalem. I asked them about the Jews who had escaped and who had survived the captivity, and also about Jerusalem. They told me, "The remnant, the ones who survived the captivity, are there in the province passing through great suffering and humiliation. The walls of Jerusalem were broken down, and its gates burned with fire." As Nehemiah heard the words loaded with sadness and despair, a whirlwind of emotions invaded his heart. The city that he loved, symbol of his heritage and faith, was practically disappearing. The walls were destroyed. The gates that once were majestic now lay in ruins. The news impacted Nehemiah deeply, making him confront the reality of the situation. Faced with this desolate panorama, Nehemiah did not give himself to despair, but found refuge in prayer. He sought the silence of his room, far from the curious eyes of the court, and prostrated himself before the God of his ancestors. His prayer was more than a lament. It was a cry for direction, wisdom, and divine intervention, faced with the critical situation of Jerusalem. Nehemiah recognized God's sovereignty over all things, and in humility confessed the sins of the people that contributed to the affliction of the city. Nehemiah's prayer to God is found in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 4 to 11, and said thus, "Lord God of the heavens, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commandments, may your ears be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant that I make today before you, day and night, for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess that we have sinned against you. I and my people have committed sins and crimes. We have acted with extreme impiety and have been rebels, not obeying your commandments, your ordinances, and the decrees that you gave to your servant Moses. Remember the word that you gave to your servant Moses when you gave him orders, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commandments, even if you are scattered in the most distant places under the heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I chose for there to make my name dwell. They are your servants and your people. It was you who with your great power and with your strong hand liberated your people, the descendants of Jacob. May you be attentive to the requests of your servant and of your servants who have pleasure in fearing your name. Grant that today your servant may be successful. Give him grace before this man. Shaktiun, he set himself to be used as an instrument in the hands of God for the restoration of the city. The communion with God gave him the clarity of purpose and the courage necessary to face the challenges that were to come. He was not content to lament the situation, but driven by faith, began to draw up plans for the reconstruction of the walls and the restoration of the dignity of Jerusalem. His desire to act and contribute to the restoration of the city became inescapable, and an opportunity arose when, on a day like any other in the Persian court, King Artaxerxes noticed the melancholy on the face of his faithful cupbearer and asks, "Why is your face sad since you are not sick?" Nehemiah, a little terrified by the king's inquiry, answers, "Live forever, King. How could my face not be sad, being the city, the place of the graves of my fathers, desolate, and its gates having been consumed by fire?" Upon questioning Nehemiah about the cause of his sadness, the cupbearer did not hesitate to share the somber news about Jerusalem. Artaxerxes, touched by Nehemiah's sincerity and loyalty, listened attentively, perceiving the determination in the eyes of his cupbearer in the challenge that was the restoration of the walls of Jerusalem. Shortly after, curious, the king asks, "What do you ask me now?" Nehemiah, still with fear, makes a quick prayer to the God of the heavens and answers shortly, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant is accepted in your presence, I ask you to send me to Judah, the city of the graves of my fathers, so that I may rebuild it." In a surprising gesture, the king offered Nehemiah permission to travel to Jerusalem and lead the reconstruction efforts. This concession, besides a formal authorization, was an act of trust and recognition of Nehemiah's capacity. The king recognized the integrity and dedication of his cupbearer, seeing in him the right person to face the immense challenge that was the restoration of the walls of Jerusalem. Thus, Nehemiah departed for his homeland, carrying the responsibility of leading the reconstruction. If you like this type of content, I ask that you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help YouTube to recommend more videos like this. And let's go to the video. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, he did not limit himself to observing the magnitude of the challenge at daylight. He understood the need for a thorough evaluation of the walls and gates. In a strategic act, Nehemiah chose to inspect the walls during the night, when the city was silent and the curious eyes were closed by sleep. He rode in secret, and accompanied by few confidants, he toured the contours of the city, Nehemiah's night inspection was more than a physical analysis of the walls. It was a symbolic act of commitment and courage. In the darkness of the night, he glimpsed the breaches in the walls, the possibilities of restoration and renewal that were waiting. It is worth remembering that shortly after his arrival, Nehemiah was faced with the skepticism and hostility of some local leaders. They questioned his intentions and ridiculed the boldness of dreaming of rebuilding what had been destroyed. However, Nehemiah's determination was not shaken. He did not let himself be carried away by the discouraging words, but with an unshakable conviction, he continued to inspire the inhabitants of Jerusalem to believe in the possibility of the reconstruction. Nehemiah was not alone in this undertaking. Among the workers were skilled masons, carpenters, and artisans, each contributing with his expertise to the reconstruction of the different parts of the walls. Men and women, young and old, all were summoned to play a crucial role in this undertaking. The diversity of the team enriched the workforce and reflected the scope of Nehemiah's commitment to involving the entire community in the effort of reconstruction. Besides the verbal opposition, Nehemiah also had to deal with physical threats and intrigues. Those who opposed the restoration of the walls conspired to undermine the leaders' efforts, launching plans that aimed to destabilize and discourage the workers. During the reconstruction, there were attacks and sabotages. However, Nehemiah's tenacity shone even more in these challenging moments. He adopted safety measures, organized defensive strategies, placed guards by night and by day, remaining firm in his purpose, refusing to yield to fear or intimidation. The resources were scarce, the logistical challenges were enormous, and the task itself seemed monumental. However, Nehemiah had armed himself with permissions before departing. He requested from the king letters with authorizations that would help him get around the difficulties. The Bible quotes this passage in the following way: "If it seems good to the king, may letters be given to me for the governors beyond the river, so that they may allow me to pass until I arrive in Judah, as well as a letter for Asaph, guardian of the king's forest, so that he may give me wood to cover the gates of the citadel house for the wall of the city, and for the house in which I am to enter." And the king gave them to me according to the good hand of God upon me. Then I went to the governors beyond the river and gave them the king's letters, and the king had sent with me captains of the army and horsemen. Nehemiah's return to Jerusalem marked not only the physical reconstruction of the walls, but also the beginning of a profound spiritual and social transformation in the community. With a holistic vision, Nehemiah summoned the community for the reading and study of the scriptures, recognizing that the spiritual foundation was as vital as the physical walls. His inspiring leadership led the people back to the fundamental principles of their faith, renewing the commitment to God. Nehemiah also undertook social reforms, seeking to resolve issues of injustice and inequality. He came across a situation in which the most vulnerable were being exploited through predatory loans. Some individuals were charging excessive interest, plunging others into unbearable debt. Nehemiah's response was immediate and decided. He confronted those responsible for the abuses, rebuking them publicly and demanding that they return what they had taken improperly. His firm posture made it clear that exploitation would not be tolerated under his leadership. Besides correcting specific abuses, Nehemiah implemented comprehensive social reforms to address these structural issues. His approach was a call for the restoration of social justice, reflecting his concern for the totality of the well-being of the community. The worship of God became the core of daily life in Jerusalem. Nehemiah encouraged the observance of the Sabbath and religious festivals, reaffirming the importance of rest and celebration as expressions of gratitude and reverence to God. Besides that, Nehemiah undertook efforts to strengthen the spiritual leadership in the city. He appointed priests and Levites to leadership roles, ensuring that the spiritual guidance was solidly established. The community's response to Nehemiah's reforms was notable. people not only welcomed the changes, but also dedicated themselves with heart to the established principles. The community demonstrated a renewed commitment to God, actively participating in the rituals and ceremonies, seeking a life of righteousness and justice. Here, a reflection is worth it. From the beginning, Nehemiah did not face the mission as a mere human undertaking, but as a task guided by the divine hand. His immeasurable faith was not just an accessory, but the foundation upon which he built his vision and action. He recognized God's sovereignty over the challenges he faced, and this trust impregnated every aspect of his decisions and leadership. Divine intervention became evident in several critical moments. When Nehemiah was before King Artaxerxes asking for permission to return to Jerusalem, God moved the monarch's heart, making him accept his departure. This concession was not just a political coincidence. It was a response to Nehemiah's faith and prayer. During the reconstruction, the adversities and oppositions were not simply overcome by human efforts, but also by the supernatural intervention of God. The community, inspired by Nehemiah's leadership, faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. Divine protection was evident when external threats could not stop the progress of the works. The final success in the reconstruction of the walls could not be attributed only to human work, but was clearly molded by divine intervention that accompanied each step. The work of Ezra and Nehemiah, together with the active involvement of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, contributed to spiritual growth and reform in the community. The renewed dedication to service to God and the return to the covenant were fundamental for the re-establishment of the relationship between God and his people. The closing of the Old Testament. The Old Testament closes with the post-restoration prophets, including Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who, through their messages, sought the people of Israel on their spiritual journey. However, with the closing of the canon of the Old Testament, the subsequent period is characterized by 400 years of apparent prophetic silence. During this interval, there is no record of new books being added to the scripture, and the voice of the prophets is not heard. This period of silence does not mean divine inactivity, but represents an era in which God was preparing the stage for the fulfillment of his messianic promises. The anxious waiting for a Messiah, prophesied throughout the Old Testament, created a growing expectation among the people of Israel. The arrival of the New Testament, inaugurated by the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem, marks the end of this period of silence. Christ, the promised Messiah, will bring the fullness of the divine promises, redemption, and salvation for humanity.